Hi, everybody. I'm Baruch, and you're listening to the Postkahanism podcast, a show where we discuss Israel's past, present, and future from a far right wing perspective, you might say. Today, we're chatting with Zev Golan about Israel's right wing liberation or dissident movements. Zev is an Israeli historian, researcher, and author. He's written numerous excellent books, including Stern, The Man and His Gang, Free Jerusalem, and the Western Wall Wars. And he has a new book that just came out that we'll discuss, hopefully. Zev, please tell the audience a bit about yourself.
I made Aliyah after studying philosophy in the States many, many years ago, and fell into the subject of the Jewish undergrounds when I was walking through what was then called the Hall of Heroism in Jerusalem. Now it's called the Underground Prisoners Museum, and they needed a tour guide. And while I had no idea what was inside, I did speak English, and they asked me to do the tour. So I did a tour and made up stories as I was going along. Jabotinsky sat in this room, things like that. But they loved my tour, and they hired me. And then I ended up interviewing all of the prisoners who would bring their grandchildren to show them where they really did sit. And I got a huge number of stories and insights into the various underground movements, the Haganah, the Irgun, the Lehi, the Stern Gang, and began collecting these stories, which I eventually turned into books. And as I was asked to do more research and into specific aspects of it, published more books. And that's how I got into the subject of the Jewish undergrounds.
Okay. So on that note, what were the roots? Let's discuss the roots of right-wing dissidents and insurgency in the land of Israel. Who are the relevant people, and where did the ideology come from?
Well, it's rather ironic, since you talk about right-wing dissidents or right-wing liberation movements in the case of Israel. But I say it's ironic because the roots were basically in left-wing liberation movements abroad. Not in all cases, but certainly in the case of the people who came from what was then the Soviet Union, who made Aliyah from Russia in the Tsarist days or in the Soviet days. And they absorbed the spirit of revolution. In the case of, I'll do it chronologically to give you a complete answer instead of jumping right to Avram Stern, who was perhaps the most interesting of the characters. But if I go back to the very beginning, they came here imbued with the spirit of revolution, the spirit of the Narodniks from the 1800s who fought the Tsar and actually assassinated and tried to assassinate any number of high Russian officials. And this was the spirit that motivated them. So you had people, the first people who came here were from HaShomer, let's say, and the HaShomer people who wanted Jewish people in Israel to be the guards of Jewish communities instead of hiring Arabs to protect them. They wanted essentially to create a Jewish self-defense and then defense, and then more than that, a force, which one could argue eventually evolved into the IDF, to the army. And they were socialists. And Trumpeldor, the famous soldier who fought in the Russian army and then came here and defended the fort of Tel Chai in the Galilee and fought off Arab marauders until he and several others of his defenders were killed. And he became Jabotinsky's hero, such that Beitar, the youth movement founded by Jabotinsky, was named for Trumpeldor, Beitar, Brit Trumpeldor. And Trumpeldor was a socialist. All of these people originally were socialists. So the origin of right-wing, you call right-wing, fighting in Israel was left-wing, fighting abroad. And many of the people who came here in HaShomer were actually activists organizing self-defense against the pogromists in 1903 and 1905 in Russia. And it was only with the Irgun that the roots of their ideology were not in the socialist movements that proceeded abroad or in Israel, but people like Menachem Begin, who were anti-socialists and anti-communists, and he, in fact, was put in jail by the Soviet secret police before making Aliyah. So Begin had the roots, and he took from Garibaldi in Italy, who fought to reunite Italy, Mazzini, who also had this ideology of Italian revolution, and people in Poland who did that, who were not left wing. And then you come to Stern. I'll conclude this long answer to your question with Stern. You can focus on anything you would like after that if I've said something that you disagree with or agree with. But Stern, he was essentially about 11 or 12 or 13 when the Russian Revolution broke out, World War I broke out, and he's a refugee, and he leaves his home in Poland, and he goes into exile with his family, with his mother anyway, and brother in deep Russia, and then he comes back alone. He walks back alone, barefoot, with no money and nearly no clothing and no food, and he gets from St. Petersburg down to his home in Poland, and he's 13 years old. But in the course of those few years that he was a refugee, he absorbed the Russian revolutionary spirit, again from the left, let's say, and the Polish revolutionary spirit, what was there, and the poetry and the songs that were being sung and written in those times, Mayakovsky in Russia and other poets. And then he comes back here and creates a revolutionary movement which unites left and right. Unlike the Irgun, which basically was on the right, and which basically was on the left, he unites everything, religious and secular, and right-wing and left-wing, socialists and capitalists, and he puts them all into a revolutionary movement, which he calls the Jewish revolutionary movement, that's going to last essentially, in his view, forever. Because even when a state is established one day, he felt that this movement would continue to be the vanguard within the Jewish state. So those were the roots, and I hope I've answered your question.
So what was the root of the split? You could say rightwards, even I think for Lehi, I mean, the establishment did not view them as dissidents from the left, right? They did not view them as socialist dissidents or communist dissidents. They viewed them as dissidents from the right. Well, what was the root of the split there?
Well, there were several splits, all of which are very exciting stories. The first split was from the Haganah, which in the 1929 riots, when the Arabs rioted in Israel, killed about 133 Jews, wounded several hundred others across the country, murder, rape, terrible tortures, and murder throughout the country. Entire Jewish communities were wiped out. The British evacuated any Jews who were left in whatever cities the Arabs had not killed. All of the Jews, Hebron, in Sfat, and in other places. And the people in the Haganah, in the ranks, were terribly disappointed that their leadership had not prepared for such a disaster and was not able to defend those Jewish communities. And the people who were upset, especially with this feeling, gravitated to a few people who created a new group called the Irgun. And there were two groups in the Irgun, one of which was led by Avraham Tahomi, who, while he admired Jabotinsky, was not a right-winger. He was a Haganah man. And the other one was led by Moshe Rosenberg, who was a Beitar. And the Beitari, Rosenberg, gathered around him about 1,000 or 1,500 Beitarim who formed the nucleus of this Irgun that Tahomi was establishing together with Rosenberg. They were what you would call, in any case, right, on the right, because they had grown up in Jabotinsky's movement and they were definitely not socialists. So that was the original split that created the Irgun. But the Irgun broke apart 5 years later when Tahomi went back to the Haganah because he wanted a national army and he felt the Irgun wasn't doing that. And then 4 years later comes the split, which I think you're referring to, which is when Stern leaves the Irgun. Stern was a member of the Irgun High Command. He was not somebody who came up from nowhere. He and David Raziel had joined the Irgun together in the early 30s and risen through the ranks together. And Raziel was by then the commander-in-chief. And Stern was in charge of propaganda, newspapers, illegal immigration to Israel. He spent most of his time in Europe, not in Israel, organizing the movement of Jews from Poland and other places, transferring. He's in charge of transferring weapons from Italy and then from Poland. Huge numbers of weapons smuggled in and washing machines and other things into Israel. And Stern, when he gets back to Israel in 1939, he's told that Raziel was just arrested by the British, and he's called back, and he is not the commander-in-chief. There's another man named Kalai who was the commander-in-chief, or the acting commander, but Stern is certainly considered the main force in the Irgun. And while for the first few months of his return, the attacks the Irgun carried out are still against Arabs as they had been before that, by the end of the summer, he's changed that, Stern, and he's moved the guns from pointing at Arabs to pointing at the British, and he's identified the British as the enemy, not the Arabs. And he leads the first attacks. He plans and he writes and he organizes until he and the entire command are arrested. In the same night that World War II breaks out in Poland, and the Germans invade Poland, the same night the British arrest the entire high command of the Irgun in a hideout in Tel Aviv and send them all to jail for the better part of a year. They're in jail from September 1939 till June 1940. In jail, Stern and the other commanders sitting in the Jerusalem jail in cell 43, I think, they find out that Raziel has made a truce with the British and agreed not to fight during World War II, to help the British fight the Germans. You can make an argument that this was a moral decision, let's say, to fight the Germans and not to fight the British who are fighting the Germans. You can also argue that it was a bad political decision because Raziel didn't get anything in return. Stern's argument was, if the British commit themselves to giving us a Jewish state and to helping the Jews make Aliyah during the war, after the war, then there's at least a basis for saying maybe we should cooperate with them. But as long as the British are still committed to essentially creating an Arab-dominated government in what was then Palestine and Eretz Israel after the war, there's no point in talking to them unless you're shooting at them. And this was his view and the view of all of the other commanders. Raziel was alone in saying that you should make a deal with the British. And so there were huge arguments in jail. Zeroni was a man named Benjamin Zeroni, was the highest ranking commander on the outside at the time, and he refused to cooperate with the truce that Raziel was declaring. Raziel said, I'm ordering you to issue this document saying that we're not going to fight. And Zeroni said, I can't do it. I won't do it. Raziel says, that's a direct order from your commander. And the other people argued, this commander, Raziel, is in jail, and he can't issue orders from jail. And in any case, somebody issued the order declaring the truce. It wasn't Zeroni. I think it was Raziel's sister who wrote it. But in any case, as soon as the members of the command got out of British detention in June 1940, they essentially created the Stern Group. They left the Irgun. It took a few months from the time that they issued their declaration saying there is no truce to the time that there was an official split. But the split happened at the end of 1940. And at that point, Stern created his new movement, which he saw not as a continuation, but as a revolutionary movement, and not as, essentially, what we would say revolutionary, urban revolutionaries, fighting the British and any other person or group who would stand in the way of creating a Jewish state, and afterwards making alliances, and even during the fight, alliances with anyone who would fight the main enemy, which in this case is the British. So that's how the split took place.
Very, very interesting. Now, Tahomi, I believe he eventually left and lived in Hong Kong the rest of his life, if I'm not mistaken. And I think he said that he was the one that had killed Arlozorov. Is that correct?
Oh, no, not at all. No.
Or was it Dahan?
Dahan, yes.
Dahan.
Definitely not Arlozorov. Arlozorov was apparently killed by two Arabs who were trying to either rob him and his wife or assault his wife on the beach in Tel Aviv. But no, he was not Tahomi was nowhere near that at the time. Tahomi was a member. Tahomi, by the way, I met him. He did not live the rest of his life in Hong Kong. I met him in California. But he was, without a doubt, of all of the people I've interviewed, all of the people I've met, presidents, former presidents, prime ministers, authors, musicians, people I've interviewed and written about, he was without a doubt the most impressive person I've ever met in my life. I walked into the room with him. He was there with his wife. And I just wanted to salute. The minute I saw him, you could not have any other feeling towards this man except wanting to salute him. It was Israel's loss that he did not live the rest of his life in Israel. He should have been a minister of defense, without a doubt. Tahomi was a principled, dedicated, very smart man. And I say that not to praise his deeds or criticize them, but to explain them. He believed fervently that Israel needed an army. I stress that because Stern, you may recall, I said a minute ago, created a revolutionary movement. That was not Tahomi's view. Tahomi wanted an army. So he was in the Haganah because he saw the Haganah as the army. When it became clear that the Haganah was under the control of the Histadrut labor union, and essentially a socialist movement that was becoming beholden to the party and not to the nation, which was in 1929, 1930, he left and he created the Irgun. When it became clear to him, which I think was not incorrect, by the mid to late 30s, that the Irgun was not going to be this national army, but was going to be a revisionist part of the revisionist movement. And as I say, he idolized Jabotinsky. He once told me something he said to Jabotinsky, and I said, "Were you serious? You really meant that?" And he said, "One did not joke with Jabotinsky." I mean, this was 50, 60 years after that meeting between the two of them. But he definitely respected Jabotinsky, but he did not want to be part of a sectarian movement. And he thought at that point, incorrectly, that the Haganah would assume that role if he rejoined it with 1,000 or 2,000 members of the Irgun. And he did, for that reason, rejoin the Haganah. He brought with him, of the 3,000 or so members of the Irgun, about 1,000 or 1,500. And unfortunately, they were essentially absorbed, as it is said of the cows in Pharaoh's dream, that Joseph interprets. The fat cows ate the thin cows, and you couldn't tell the thin cows were there. So the
thin cows ate the fat cows.
The thin cows ate the fat cows. Sorry, and you couldn't tell they were there. Thank you. So they were absorbed, and Tahomi himself was not given any position of leadership, and eventually his participation in the Haganah withered away, and he worked on various intelligence issues in the 40s, but essentially was lost to the defense and security movements of Israel. And because he had left the Irgun, even though he was idolized by his soldiers, he was not idolized by the leadership, which saw him as a deserter from the cause, had turned to the other side. On the other hand, the Haganah, which was a victim of his first split and didn't trust him after the second movement when he came back, they didn't want anything to do with him. And so he never found his place in Israel. And he told me he couldn't get stuff published here. He told me that he felt like an outsider here. He was not with this group or that group, and you had to be part of a group in Israel at the time. And so he turned to making money, and he worked in gems or diamonds or something like that, which is why he was in Hong Kong. But eventually he moved to California, which is where I met him. I met him in Santa Monica. And that's where he lived the last years of his life. And he wrote at least 2 books. I say at least because there's according to David Tidar, who did an encyclopedia of the founders of Israel, he had a manuscript for another book, which is supposedly telling the story of the underground movements in Israel up until his departure from them. But I have been unable to find such a manuscript. We spoke in Hebrew, and he was deeply committed to Israel, but he couldn't find a place here.
It's tragic. That's very tragic. So, ideologically, there were at least three sides here, right? The side of the establishment, which it seems to me ideologically they were largely gray men. Maybe some fervent leftists or communists, but largely it seems like they didn't have a very cohesive vision. They would go from will be something of an outpost of Europe and the British Empire here to we'll build a safe refuge here for the Jewish people, to it'll be some kind of socialist dream. This may be, I've heard it said that this was the reason that they did not focus on defense as much as they should have, because they were leftists and they thought that eventually there'd be no need for defense, there'd be no need for war. We'd build some kind of socialist soup here where people just wouldn't settle their differences through organized violence and warfare. And then there was Begin's view, and I guess the revisionist view, and then there was Stern's view, which is something else. Could you maybe elaborate? Correct me if I'm wrong on any of those.
I think that the what you've describes Israel today, or at least the leadership of the army today, which perhaps we can save for a later part of this discussion.
Sure.
But I'm not sure it describes what happened comprehensively in the past, because your description of the leftist approach, contrasted to Begin's and Stern's, which are easier to describe, it pertains to a certain part of the socialist school. It's the Brit Shalom, cooperation with the Arabs, a binational state, which was propounded by certain people like Reb Benjamin or Martin Buber, or the president of Hebrew University in the 1920s.
Magnus, yes.
So excuse me?
Magnus,
yes. So they opened a school for peace in the 1920s, a cathedra, a school for peace, or something like that. Because this was not the overall approach of the socialist movements at the time. As I mentioned before, HaShomer came, led by Israel and Manya Shochad, and they sprung up and they wanted a socialist movement to work for the workers. In fact, so much so that you couldn't be a member of their organization if you were a farmer. Half the people in HaShomer wanted to be farmers. They all wanted to have their own land, but the farmers were kept away from them because they were property. They had something of their own, and you had to be a socialist worker wandering from town to town who believed in the workers of the world unite, to really believe in their ideology. So half the people in their organization didn't believe in that ideology, at least not after a year or two of trying it. But they definitely believed in fighting. Stories of the heroism, of what they did with guns, of what they did with their horses, of running into battle and fighting with Arabs. The stories are incredible, and hopefully will be the subject of one of my future books, because today we don't really know much about these people, these heroes. But the romantic aspect of their organization, what brought people to them, was not the socialist ideology of the people who founded it, but rather the romance of running around on a horse with a gun and defending your town. And the people who led this movement, or let's say half of them anyway, since they weren't monolithic, wanted eventually to create more than that. They wanted to be an impetus for attacking as well. At the time, they didn't believe in attacking for a very simple reason, which we can understand today. which is that the security system, if you can call it that, of modern states is based on armies, fighting armies and either deterring them or not deterring them and being attacked and fighting and either winning or losing. But the security system, if you can call it that, of 110 years ago in Eretz Israel was Arab, was Middle Eastern, was Bedouin, which meant there weren't armies and there weren't organized attacks, but rather there was, if I'm pronouncing the word correctly, I don't know, goom, which is like revenge. So that if somebody steals a flock of sheep, you either get the flock back or you take their sheep. If somebody kills somebody by accident or on purpose, doesn't matter, you go to that tribe of the people from whom the killer came, and you either get paid money for the loss of your loved one, or you kill someone from that tribe. And this feuding, which, as they used to call it in the South, in the States, where one person kills somebody from one family and they go back and kill someone from that family, and this goes on for decades, was what the members of HaShomer who were in Israel wanted to avoid, because they didn't think that they were capable at that point, we're talking 1910, 11, 12, 13, of organizing defense under the Ottoman Empire that was here and protecting from such ongoing bloodletting. And so they always said, if we're attacked, we shoot over the heads, we shoot at the feet, we beat them up, we knock them senseless, we take everything they own, but we don't kill them. Because if you kill them, they're going to start killing us, and we're not ready for it. There were times when they had no choice, and they did shoot to kill, and they did kill. But they were trying to avoid that. That's the only reason that members of HaShomer tried to avoid killing people. So that's then you had people like Ben Gurion, who, while I'm not trying to defend or support any particular ideology, but who built the Israeli army, built the Haganah as something that in the 40s it could become an army, and who then built the Israeli army. So I would not call all of the socialist kumbaya people who want to see peace and therefore weren't prepared for war. As I said, that typifies the members of the Israeli general staff today. But we'll leave that, as I said, for a later part of the discussion.
I was speaking to their ideology in terms of what they ultimately wanted to build here. What was their ultimate vision for after success? Once there's a state, once the state's on its feet, what did they want?
They wanted a socialist country that would, some of them believe, be at peace with the neighbors, and some of them believe would fight with the neighbors. No, they didn't. This was even in the Stern group, there were people like that. You mentioned before, I won't avoid your question, but I'll just throw this in because you mentioned before Begin and Stern too. Begin was founded what we might call militaristic Zionism, and Stern revolutionary Zionism. And Stern said clearly this will be a military camp, not because he wanted to have a military camp, but because he said anyone who sets up a Jewish country in the middle of the Middle East is going to have to live in an armed camp for decades. Now, not everyone wanted that. And because they didn't want it, they didn't see it as a necessity. It was something they wanted. They didn't, you envision what you want as opposed to reality. And Stern was a realist. He looked and he said, this is what people viewed the British as allies. Why? Because they wanted the British to be allies. They didn't want to have to fight the British. Stern said, look, these are our interests and these are the British interests, according to what they say. So clearly we're enemies. People accused him of being, for that reason, a fascist and a fifth columnist and whatever else, because they didn't want to believe that. They didn't want to see it. And he saw that clearly. And he saw clearly that Israel, the Jewish state to come, would need to be an armed camp in the Middle East. And so therefore you had to prepare for it. It would be difficult to say that to call the left in general a group that did not think that they needed to defend. Even the Lehi, which after Stern was dead, was issuing declarations to the Arabs and saying, come fight with us against the British. And there were Arab members of Lehi because they were fighting the British. They wanted to have a free country here. Some of those people believed in the Histadrut and in the labor movement, as well as in the Stern group, that in this free country, Jews and Arabs would create a new nation. Some of them believed that Jews and Arabs would cooperate as long as it took to get the British out, and then they'd fight each other, and whoever won. There were different ways of looking at it. It wasn't only one path.
Okay. Fighting aside, what was the vision for the sort of country they wanted to build? Did they want to build like I don't know, Bulgaria for Jews or something like this? Did they have kind of a cohesive vision of something? Would it be a new kind of state? Would it just be sort of another maybe Central European state popped down in the East Levant? What was the overall thinking there?
Again, I must say that it was. I apologize, but that it wasn't just one view. Yeah, Hashomer HaTzair was what we would today call far left, and they wanted, revolution of the workers fighting the capitalists together with the Arabs. Whatever you had to do to get rid of the Jewish capitalists, you do to get rid of the Jewish capitalists, and you'd have an Arab and Jewish workers living in harmony together here. But Hashomer HaTzair were also dedicated fighters when it came to that. But that was they some of the members of Hashomer, not all of them. Hashomer and Hashomer HaTzair are not the same organization. In the 30s, and in the 20s, late 20s or 30s, there are Jewish communists here, where the British largely expelled back to Russia. But they're cooperating with the Arabs. The Jewish communists are cooperating with the Arabs in organizing pogroms against Jewish communities. So you have communists on one side, and then Hashomer HaTzair, and then you've got people out in Achdut Avodah and in other parts of the left who are not sharing that same vision. And basically, they drew from. They were not religious, obviously. They didn't draw from halakha, from Jewish law, but they drew from Jewish lore, and their Jewish heritage was important to them. Many of them became fighters for what we would call the independence movement of the Jews in Eretz Israel, after they had been in Russian anti-Tsar movements, or because they were not happy with the anti-Semitism or even the anti-Semitism of the non-Jewish movements and the non-Jewish aspects of fighting for socialism. They were looking for Jewish aspects. They were looking for their heritage. So I know I keep making distinctions with the answers to your questions that are not painting one picture, because if I had to describe their view, they would want a Jewish country that would promote what we would call a welfare state today, that would promote the well-being of workers. Only the fringe believed in never-ending proletarian revolution against capitalists and cooperation with the most deadly of Israel's enemy, only the fringe, while the rest of them accepted that they would have to fight, there would be an army, and that eventually we could talk and somehow or other work things out, but they wanted to live in a Jewish country, whatever that meant. It didn't mean keeping Shabbos, but it did mean having some aspects of Judaism. In some of these groups, it was more of the prophetic Judaism, and in some it was more of the civilizational aspects. As Mordechai Kaplan said, Judaism is a civilization. some of the folk ways of Jewish heritage, but they weren't abandoning it, I think.
Well, they were. I guess what you're describing sounds like they were motivated by nationalism rather than religion, right? And they were trying to
Yeah,
build a socialist state. So, like
yeah. Except for the
social,
people. Yeah.
kind of a socialist nationalist Jewish state.
No, no, no. That's not fair.
Well, nationalist in the sense of I don't mean to draw a parallel with like National Socialism in Germany, but they didn't have a religiously motivated worldview. They had a nationally and ethnically nationally motivated worldview. They liked the culture of the Jews. They liked the Jewish people. They wanted the state to represent their interests in a socialist way. Um, and so, and when you say like the prophetic aspects of this or the civilizational aspects, could you expand on that a little bit?
It's hard to, since people have different views, but the prophetic, what people used to refer to as the prophetic morality, ethical Judaism. But based on, what makes a civilization? What makes a culture? So language makes a culture. Most of the people came here speaking Yiddish, and some of them wanted to continue speaking Yiddish, but most wanted to speak Hebrew. Most wanted to switch to Hebrew. Many of the people came here speaking Russian, Polish, whatever it is, but Yiddish was the Jewish language that they came here speaking. And eventually they all changed to Hebrew. And language is something that unites people. Another thing that unites people, that creates a culture, is the land. And most cultures stem from a land, whereas the Jewish culture for the past 2,000 years is one of wandering in diaspora and other people's lands. So these people who returned to what we would call Zionism in the early 20th century, they saw their homeland with almost without exception as being Israel, the land of Israel. And while being in Poland or Russia or any place else, the land that they told their children about, the land that they dreamed of, the land that they sang of, was the land of Israel, the hills of Israel. They may never have seen them, but this was what gave them their sense of identity. And it's certainly true, I think, for the right, what you call the right wing, but the members of Beitar and Irgun and the Stern Group, and I think it's true for the members of the left as well. This is how they read Bialik, and they read Chernyakhovsky, and they read the legends of the biblical characters that were mentioned in these poems. And this was what they dreamed of. So this is what united them. And then they had the heritage of their parents or grandparents, which they did not follow to the letter, but which they knew. They knew a midrash. They knew a smattering. So many of them learned in a cheder when they were kids, so they learned something of the Talmud, of the Gemara, and they were able to integrate this into their personality. So that is what I would call a culture that you, and a civilization, is that you have the ways of your people. It doesn't mean, fortunately or unfortunately, let's say unfortunately, it doesn't mean adopting the Talmudic view of property and of punishment for crimes and of how to write wills and testaments, but it does mean that the Sabbath should be a time for gathering together and resting. That's basically what I'm referring to.
Okay, so this was a little bit of an epiphenomenon of Judaism, from the cultural aspect, right? Like if they had been able to achieve their vision fully, it probably still wouldn't have been self-sufficient in the long term, because it's derivative of Judaism. And the following generations, if now taking one step away and you say, okay, up to here but no further, then your children will take 2 steps and your grandchildren 3 steps, and then your great-grandchildren will be in California intermarried, and you'll just be an interesting footnote in their heritage. It seems to me, right? It was a little bit of a doomed vision.
Part of the view was and is that, certainly is, that while an American Jew takes those, or American Jewish family, that takes those steps backwards, if you'll allow me to say backwards, that you've just described, each step further away, is not in the same position as an Israeli Jew. None of the people imagined in the time that we're talking about the phenomena of Yeridah, people leaving Israel. So the assumption is once they're living in a Jewish community, even if they assimilate, they're still living in a Jewish community.
It'll be stable because it's a closed garden.
Essentially.
And you don't have anybody to intermarry with except for Arabs who's going to intermarry with Arabs.
Essentially.
Right?
Essentially.
And you're not going to be culturally influenced by Arabs because to immigrants from the Russian Empire, it's just unimaginable, to see. Although they constantly did idealize the Arabs, right? When you look at the young people, like the cool thing to do would be to ride horses like the Arabs, or talk like an Arab, and all this other stuff. But I guess to the ideological people who were influenced by European culture more so than growing, I don't know, carrots in the kibbutz. This was just kind of unimaginable, and it could not be a real phenomenon in the long term.
Yeah, exactly. The idea was that the people who they're coming to emulate in the sense of dress and horseback riding is that these are the people who are living in the country now. They know the country. These people wanted to know the country too. So they wanted to explore every nook and cranny, every creek, every mountain, every hill, every cave. They wanted to get to know absolutely everything. And that's where, they go on these tiulim, they go on Shabbos mornings, usually. They go on walks and they explore the entire countryside. And then they take longer trips and they develop a love for the land itself. And that's one of the reasons they figured, listen, we've been growing up in Moscow, let's say, dressing for Moscow, and other people, in other areas. But these people have been living here. They must know how to dress for the climate that's here. And so we're going to try that. We're going to, see if we can become. And then you have people who carry this further with what you just said. The Canaanites, the Canaanite movement of Ratosh in the 30s, and then which continues through the 60s, at least, maybe even the 70s. The Canaanite movement, which wants to, join together with the Arabs and create what they call the Canaanite culture, which wasn't really referring to ancient Canaan, but rather to some sort of locally produced tribe that would unite all of the peoples who are native to the lands, the Arabs and the Jews, but doing exactly what you just said.
Okay. If it's okay by you, I'd like to take a 3-minute break. So I'll pause recording here, and then we'll start again in a second, okay?
Okay.
Okay, and we're back. So just one final question on the ideological side of things. Stern seemed to have a vision that was qualitatively different in terms of span and cohesion. Of course, he was maybe more educated than the average ideologue. He had a doctorate from where was it again? He studied in Venice.
Florence.
Florence.
He was studying for that.
Yeah. So he had a vision that was, I think, kind of much grander. Lehi's 19 points culminated in the building of the temple, and Stern himself came to religious observance, kept the Shabbat, and so on. Can you maybe describe his vision a little bit?
Yeah, indeed. I would crystallize it with by saying that the last point in his program for his revolutionary movement was the rebuilding of the temple. The phrase was the rebuilding of the temple as a symbol of complete redemption. The beginning of the the program, as he wrote it, based our claim to Eretz Israel in the Bible, quoting the book of Genesis and the promise of God to Abraham. So his movement was did not only stem from people who had this background, but was steeped itself in this religious / nationalist view of the Jewish people. And he also included in the program that there would be no poverty and things like that, but there was no program as to how to reach that goal. In other words, he was not a socialist or a capitalist, and he did not want to be. He did say that the role of the movement was to educate people forever, to be attached to the land and to be attached to the idea of independence and freedom for the Jewish people, and that this would be a never-ending struggle, such that the culmination, the building of the temple, would symbolize either that it had been accomplished or that this would symbolize the ongoing efforts to achieve it. It's difficult to say what he meant by the complete redemption, but essentially it would be without a doubt, points that he included were an ingathering of the exiles, an adoption of Jewish culture as opposed to foreign culture, and promoting the Jewish heritage and all the aspects that we've discussed previously from all of the different movements that relate to the Jewish heritage, and building the temple and such. And so his view was much more of what we would call Jewish, and much less of what we would call Soviet, Polish, assimilation. European, yes, Western. That would be how I would answer your question.
It's interesting because it echoes Maimonides in the Mishneh Torah when he speaks about what is the Mashiach, what is the Messiah supposed to do. One of the today, one of the most common pejorative terms that the left uses against the right is that they're messianic, which is very funny that they use that as a slur, because traditionally all Jews have been messianic. Every religious Jew prays for the coming of the Messiah, the Messianic kingdom, and building of a temple and so on, 3 times a day at least. But it seems like Stern was the only one who had an actual Jewish messianic vision, or a vision of the Jewish state as redemption, as the Geulah, which Jews have traditionally prayed for, and the Jews that would stop praying for it would very shortly stop being Jewish. They would assimilate. So he seems to be connected to kind of the wellspring of Jewish existence in a way that maybe the other guys were not. That even if they'd succeeded, they would have built something that would be, again, Hebrew-speaking Bulgaria, and in a few generations, it would be whatever it would be. It wouldn't be anything very impressive. So what united all these guys, and Lehi as well, after Stern was killed by the British, was a common goal, which was the expulsion of the British. I'm talking about the dissidents specifically, not necessarily the Zionist establishment, which went back and forth. And if they'd had their druthers, perhaps they would have preferred to be some sort of federated subject of the British Empire, something like maybe a Hebrew-speaking Australia or something along those lines, Hong Kong. And they succeeded. They fought against the British. Eventually, the British issued a very sniffy statement, in view of the lack of, you bring it in, Stern, the man and his gang. It's something like, in view of the lack of cooperation and the ongoing attacks that we faced, you people can just keep this whole, we're leaving. It was very like indignant, and they did leave. And this, reading Dr. Uri Milstein's history of the War of Independence, it seems like this was a blow to the dissident movements, the right-wing insurgencies, because their reason for existing had been sort of pulled out from under their feet, as it were. And the Zionist establishment very much was aware of this, and they had a conversation. What should we do with these guys? And the view that more or less prevailed was, well, nothing. They have no reason to exist now, so they won't be such a problem. Um, and in fact, they were not. They were absorbed, right? But their last hurrah was the war against the independence war, at least the beginning parts, where they fought against the Arabs, especially in Jerusalem, maybe culminating in Deir Yassin, and that was kind of it. Is that about an accurate assessment? We'll say the Altalena as well, right?
What about Bernadette?
And Bernadotte. So in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was not supposed to be partitioned and go to the Jews or the Arabs, it took quite a while longer for the Zionist establishment to really establish itself, and so they got a little bit more mileage out of it. Sure, absolutely.
The point is that if you look at the contributions to the War of Independence, without a doubt, the Haganah, which led by Ben Gurion, was the main force that handled the war. Lehi wasn't ready for it at all. Lehi had focused so entirely on the British. And as I mentioned before, some people in Lehi believed that the Arabs would continue cooperating with them throughout. So they had not prepared for an Arab front. In the memoirs of Israel Eldad was a member of the hierarchy, the triumvirate, the three people who ran Lehi after Stern was killed. And he was the ideological man. He was the newspaper publisher, the writer, the teacher. And he says this in his memoirs, which I translated into English about 15 years ago as the first tithe. And he says, we were not ready for an Arab front. We didn't want to believe that it would be necessary. And until the last minute, we were calling on the Arabs to be friends rather than preparing to fight them. Ben Gurion, for all of his faults, was not preparing to fight the British at all, but he was preparing to fight the Arabs. And so when the time came that the British left, and essentially the Irgun and the Lehi won the war, you quoted what I quoted. You quoted me quoting the British communique, but they didn't. It wasn't just a matter of they're not cooperating. Specifically, they're not cooperating in the fight against what the British called terrorism. They're not cooperating in defeating the people who were fighting the British. That's what they were bemoaning, that they couldn't get the cooperation of the Jewish community. And they say clearly in their communique that they're leaving because 96,000 or whatever the number was, British soldiers could not contain the insurgents who were fighting the British here. And those were not the members of the Haganah, because the Haganah was not fighting them. There was only the Irgun and the Stern Group who were doing that. You had about 5,000 members of the Irgun, more or less, and about 1,000 or so members of the Stern Group. So you had about 6,000 people, which is 1% of people in Eretz Yisrael when the state was established, are fighting the British. And so that's why they left. And when they left, the Irgun and the Stern Group, who had won that war, were, as you pointed out, left to be nowhere, essentially, because now it was clear that the fight was against the Arabs. The Arabs attacked Israel the day after the UN voted to establish a Jewish and an Arab state. And while the Jews danced, the Arabs attacked. And this became an open war the day after the British left, and Ben Gurion declared the state in May of 48. So at that point, there's no more illusion. There's no more British to fight. And there's only Arabs, and the Stern Group and the Irgun are not ready for it. So the Haganah, essentially Palmach, they become the divisions. And in the course of May, members of the Stern Group and members of the Irgun join, late May, join the Israel Defense Forces, sometimes in units of their own, in the case of the Stern Group, and sometimes not. So this is what happened in 48 to the remnants of the people who were fighting the British.
Okay. And so in some ways, the successful end of the War of Independence represents kind of irrelevance for these groups, sort of the end, maybe temporary, of right-wing dissident movements and right-wing insurgency and resistance. You have a little bit in the 50s, I believe, with the only mention I've been able to find is that there was a group called Malchut Israel, which was implicated in the Kostner assassination, which may or may not have been under the wing of the Shin Bet. It's not entirely clear to me. But in general, there's sort of a feeling of, okay, well, whatever it is we were fighting for, we won it, and I guess this is what it is, so on to new things. Shamir joins the Mossad. Nathan Yellen-Moore continues being a commie, and Eldad is basically becomes a persecuted professional intellectual, more or less, right? There's a Supreme Court case where he's suing because he's denied the ability to even teach in schools, which he wins. But in general, that's sort of the end for now of right-wing armed dissidents, right-wing resistance, and so on. Is that about accurate?
I think so. Yeah. I'll add, without disagreeing with anything you said, I'll add that in terms of the contribution in 48, you mentioned the Altalani, you mentioned Der Yassin. The Irgun would look at its major, I think, the Irgun would perhaps look at its major contribution to
Manshia, yes.
Exactly, the conquest of Jaffa, which was an Irgun operation, without a doubt, and they did what others couldn't do. And Gidi Paglan, the mastermind of that operation, he figured out how to do it, and they made their way to the sea, and they cleared Jaffa of the snipers who were shooting at Tel Aviv, and they made it a Jewish and essentially a Jewish Arab city, as it is today. And the Lehi would look at its major contribution. It made several contributions to the war effort. But I think the members of Lehi would look at its major contributions, what I mentioned before, which was the assassination of Bernadotte. Bernadotte had been sent by the United Nations to essentially impose a peace here, and he saw his role as making sure that the Jewish state stayed small and the Arab state stayed nice-sized, and Bernadotte, would be the man in charge of Palestine to make sure it all worked out, and he would get Jerusalem as his base, and it would be an international city under his control, and he sent people to ports around the world to stop Jewish males from making Aliyah. With he had no authorization, obviously, to do this, except his own. And he literally had agents in ports in Europe preventing Jewish men from making Aliyah. Ben Gurion, the entire Jewish leadership viewed him as the enemy, viewed him as a bad guy who was trying to mess up the Jewish state, and Lehi killed him. I don't think anyone was upset in terms of the Jewish community in Israel about such an action, and about its result, which was the death not only of Bernadotte as a person, but of his plan to internationalize half the country and shrink the Jewish state. Ben Gurion and the government were obviously upset that a foreign dignitary had been shot on their watch, and so they, issued the requisite statements, and they did what they could to ensure that things like this wouldn't happen again. In the case of Lehi, it meant that Ben Gurion arrested everyone who was a member of Lehi and sent them to jail. Hundreds of people were imprisoned in Jaffa, in the Jaffa prison, until about half of them broke out, and 2 or 3 of them were put on trial, including Yellen, who was, as you said, he stayed on the left for the rest. So they would see that as their contribution, as ending the internationalization of the country and the shrinking of the Jewish state. In terms of Yellenmore, to follow up on something else that you've said, while he remained far left for the rest of his life and was therefore marginalized and had very little influence on the public as a whole, he, in 48, if you read his statements in 48, here you've got this far left guy who's committed to, let's say, socialist ideals, more or less, not completely, but to the idea that the proletariat is going to be the force that matters in the future, who wants a friendship with Russia as opposed to America. Here you've got this guy and his declarations in 48, when he's opposing Eldad, the right winger, the messianic guy, his declarations are, we have to conquer all of Jerusalem, we have to liberate the whole country. We have just the same words as Eldad, same words as Eldad. So it's only later that he abandons those ideas and focuses entirely on cooperating with the Arabs and fomenting a similar evolution to the one that Lehi led among the Jews, among the local Arabs and on other Arab nations in the Middle East to get the British out of the Middle East. But nonetheless, in terms of the Jewish heritage or the Jerusalem and the land of Israel, in 48, he's as committed to that as anyone else. And you talk about then the next step, having said those things, that, as I said, I agree with what you said about the marginalization afterwards. Indeed, Ben Gurion has Eldad fired, his teacher in school. And his rationale is, Eldad says, I'm not teaching ideology. I'm not teaching the history of the Stern Group. I'm teaching, Bible. And Ben Gurion says, you would manage to get your ideology even into Hebrew grammar. And Eldad agrees. He says, he was right. I would have. But nonetheless, the courts rule that Eldad he can't be fired by the prime minister or the defense minister who's working for the Ministry of Education. And nonetheless, nobody will hire him because he's got, the mark of Cain on his forehead. Ben Gurion is labeled in such and such. So nobody will hire him. But he publishes this revolutionary journal until 63 or so, called Sulam, the ladder that will take us from the land to the heaven, from the physical to the spiritual, and unite all aspects of Judaism and bring us closer to God and liberate the entire homeland from the Nile to the Euphrates. And he publishes maps, the famous postcard. Sorry, I don't have one here to hold up, but this famous postcard that he issues in the 60s where you see a map of the entire land of Israel. And I don't know, did he have 2,000 readers? Let's say he had 2,000 readers. But this is really his scope. We know that we know that Ben Gurion read it, and we know that the security forces read it because every once in a while there are paragraphs marked out, either with magic markers or big white spaces in the middle of pages where the security forces have deleted things. And I read these revolutionary journals from the 50s, and I say to myself, my God, given what they left in, which clearly calls for, revolution and toppling the government and all that stuff, what did they take out? Because what's in there is pretty incendiary. It's pretty, rough stuff. But nonetheless, there were things taken out every once in a while. As you said, there's this intimation this accusation that he and others were involved in the assassination of Kastner, who was an employee of the Ministry of Industry, if I'm not mistaken, and who was accused by a very small newspaper having nothing to do with Eldad or the revolutionaries or the right, with having cooperated with the Germans in the destruction of Hungarian Jewry. It's a very heavy accusation, and it's a very touchy matter even today. And it's not easy to determine in black and white that he acted out of a sense of evil or out of a sense of beneficence. It was a very problematic area. I think that most people who analyze such periods of history should be thankful that they didn't live through it, and they didn't have to make such decisions about whether you cooperate with the Germans to save a few Jews or whether you call on all the Jews to resist and maybe risk losing everyone. These are very tough issues. The big problem with Kastner in Israel, as I see it, is not that Kastner did what he did and came to Israel. Because you can, as I say, I think that what he did was wrong, but I'm speaking to you in an easy chair with a view of the mountains in the Galilee, and I didn't live through it. But the big problem was that when he came here, and when he got a job, and when he was accused of this, the Israeli establishment adopted him and accepted his view.
Well, it's a
and
question.
This means the question that whether you can sacrifice a large number of Jews to save some. And this ideology, a man I once worked with worked very closely with in the 90s, Professor Lowenberg, wrote a very long piece about this. And he was accused of comparing the Israeli government to Nazis, which in no way he did, in no way. But he was making an assessment of what your view is. Can you sacrifice some for others, or do you have to defend all of your people? And it was his view that the Israeli government then in the 50s, by defending Kastner, adopted the view that you could indeed sacrifice part of your people to save others. And this was exactly the approach of Shimon Peres in the 90s and the early 2000s, when he talked about victims of peace. In order to reach peace, Israel will have to sacrifice thousands of people. And to Lowenberg, who was writing this piece, who I was working, I didn't have anything to do with the piece as it was written, but I was working with him at the time. This was an anathema. The role of the government, the only role, legitimate role of the government, is to defend its people. And it can't say we're going to sacrifice some to save others. It can't say we're going to sacrifice thousands here because we might be able to do something later. You can't do that as a government. Your role is to protect your people. So that was his part. So Kastner was indeed killed by a person who indeed, as you mentioned, without stating it categorically, but indeed had worked for the Israeli security services. He was not sent by Eldad to do that. He was not sent by the revolutionary right-wing movement to do that. He had worked for the security service. Whether he did it at their behest or did it on his own because he was decided to do it, that is a question that nobody has answered until today. But once it was done, as essentially the Israeli government made Eldad and the right-wing revolutionary movement in Israel, such as small as it was, the scapegoat. And the trial of the man who did the killing was part and parcel of trials of people who were connected to Eldad. And so that was, it's hard to say that was the end, because it wasn't really part of the revolutionary, of the right-wing dissident movement. And it's hard to say it was the end, because I'm not sure what was there to end at that point. I mean, Eldad had his followers, but they weren't really, they were writing about it, but they weren't throwing out the government. They weren't instigating armed uprising. They didn't have any arms. They didn't have the army. So it's difficult to know exactly what they ended by doing that, but it was definitely an attempt by the government to make sure that this group would never get any.
You can say it was a postscript. There's two things that I want to bring up. One is that I've come across mention in various fringe publications of some sort of Lehi link assassination plot to kill Truman that was discovered and that failed. Have you heard anything about that?
No. There was a revelation, if you can call it that, by people who don't know the details of the history, who said they've discovered something. There was a revelation some years ago. I don't remember how many years ago, 10, maybe less. I don't remember. That Lehi had planned to assassinate Bevan, who was the British foreign minister. And that is definitely true. I spoke with a person who planted a bomb, which was supposed to go off and kill Bevan in Parliament. I also found in the memoirs of a French revolutionary, let's call him that, or a French activist. I found in his memoirs an admission, without mentioning names, that he had crafted a bomb at the behest of Lehi, but he had crafted it in such a way that it wouldn't go off. So that the reason the bomb didn't go off, by putting two and two together, is that the bomb they were given by this French partisan in the past was not able to go off. But the bomb sat under Bevan's seat for quite some time in Parliament without being discovered until Lehi sent another agent to pick it up and take it out. I do not know of any plan to kill Truman, nor can I imagine any logic that would have led Lehi to think in any way that that would have been a good idea. They had no, Yellenmore being pro-Russian to an extent, or seeing the future as Russia's future, definitely wanted Russia in the area, even though they claimed they wanted a neutral Middle East with no superpowers here. Lehi's official position from the mid-40s on was that there'd be a neutral Middle East, no superpowers, no Americans, no Russians, no British, just the locals, and we would somehow or other get together and be happy. But and Lehi made outreach to the leaders of the communist movement, and a successful outreach to the leader of Bulgaria, and through him to Stalin. Some people in Lehi believed that this was the reason that Stalin okayed the shipment of arms to Israel and why they supported Israel in the UN in 1948. Other people do not accept that as a correct assessment of Lehi's role, but they definitely were in good with the head of Bulgaria, who helped the Jews of Bulgaria make Aliyah and who sent messages to Stalin. But on the other hand, Lehi also had people in America, their agent in America, their chief agent, had a bunch, was named Benjamin Gepner, whom I spent a lot of time with, was a really nice guy, a cute guy. When I knew him anyway, he was in his mid-90s. And I quote him at the beginning of one of my books, of the Stern book that you mentioned, Stern, the Man and His Gang. I have a little quote from him saying, Lehi was fire. You cannot touch it. I really like that quote. Anyway, he was leading the Lehi movement in the States and working with people from all different backgrounds. But one of the people that he was close with and whom he was successful in working with was Henry Wallace, who had been vice president of America. He was a progressive man, and he was replaced on the ticket by Roosevelt with Truman for the last time that Roosevelt was elected, which meant that when Roosevelt died shortly afterwards, Truman became president. But Henry Wallace had been vice president and adopted the Lehi line that what was needed in the Middle East was neutralization, was getting all the superpowers out. And Gepner was the one who had met with him and set up this, talked to him about this policy and given him literature about it and such. So Lehi was doing well in the States. They had camps for kids in New York and New Jersey. They were not looking to antagonize the American government. They were not looking to get rid of Truman, certainly, who had also supported Israel at the United Nations, though afterwards he did embargo the shipment of arms, and Israel was getting its arms from the communist bloc, let's say, from Czechoslovakia, in Europe. But on the other hand, there was a lot of smuggling going on in America. And a lot of arms were coming to Israel from America. And Lehi was not involved, to my knowledge, in any way at that point in 48 in smuggling arms. It was all the Haganah. And so I can't imagine why Lehi wouldn't. And they didn't have the people in America to do it either. They had Benjamin Gepner and some camps for children and 3 or 4 other agents in this huge country of America who were not secret. They weren't going by false names. They were married in many cases, and they were in good with the unions. They were in good with the Bohemians and the authors. And it's very hard to imagine that anyone in Lehi would have considered the idea that Truman was worth killing.
Okay. There seems to be a little bit of a recurring pattern where, let's say, Lehi and the Irgun, they do something which the establishment actually benefits from and maybe wanted them to do in the first place, and then the establishment reaps the benefits and sort of throws them under the bus. 3 examples: Manshia, which was the conquest of Jaffa by the Irgun. They were actually fighting some British advisors in there as well, and they were forced to use, because they had not prepared any sort of supporting fires, mortars, or artillery. They were forced to use basically sappers with satchel charges instead of supporting fire, which obviously brought huge casualties and so on. And the establishment reaped the benefits of that. There was Dir Yassin, which even though there had been there's a question of whether they actually killed prisoners of war. And there had been establishment forces that did worse things, but Dir Yassin was benefited from by the establishment in 2 ways. First of all, they used it to condemn Lehi and the Irgun and paint them with a very black brush and gain internal political advantage. They also, by advertising it, motivated a massive exodus of Arab refugees. The Arabs also contributed. The Arabs also advertised it as, look what these Zionists are doing. But it backfired on them in that they thought it would motivate the Arabs to come together and fight the Jews. It actually motivated the Arabs to flee. So they benefited from that. And then Bernadotte, as you said, who's a guy that everybody on the Jewish side really, nobody was sad that he died. It benefited everybody. But it was also used at the same time to sort of as a rope with which to hang the Lehi folks. And finally, Kastner, because Kastner at this point was a massive, massive inconvenience. The question of how much he was acting in his capacity as a functionary of the Zionist movement in collaboration with the Nazis, that question came up. The establishment had made a big deal of suing Malkiel Grunwald for slander of Kastner. Malkiel Grunwald was the guy with the tiny fringe newspaper that had surfaced these accusations, and the trial went poorly, very poorly. And so there was supposed to be a follow-on trial where they were going to try Kastner. And there it could be expected that whether it was true or not, Kastner's line of defense would be, I was following orders. I was working on behalf of the Zionists. Like, what do you guys want from me? It would have been a massive, massive embarrassment. And therefore, the fact that he was killed really benefited everybody. And then, as you said, again, they used that as a stick with which to beat Eldad and his crew. So there's kind of an ongoing pattern. Maybe I'm hallucinating, but it seems to me there's an ongoing pattern of relationships between the right-wing fringe and the left-wing establishment in this country, where the latter is using the former to do its dirty work, and then using that dirty work to convict the former. If that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. And it goes back even further. I remember when I interviewed Rabbi Moshe Segal, who was a member of Brit HaBrionim and a member of the Irgun and a member of the Lehi High Command, the Irgun High Command, and a member of Lehi, commander of Jerusalem for Lehi, and then member of the establishment Jerusalem Committee in 48 that ran the city under Dov Yosef, and the first Jewish person to move back to the old city in 67. He told me the story of the defense of Tel Aviv in 29, when the Arabs were attacking pogroms across the country, and Tel Aviv was threatened. And he said there were two neighborhoods, Oved and Shapira, that Beitar defended. And he told me in absolute detail, I put it into at least one of my books, of the defense, of who was commanding and who was shooting and what they did and what he did. He was sent to get the women and children out of the neighborhood. There was one lady who was hysterical and she wouldn't leave, and he pointed a gun at her and said, "You're coming with me now." And she left. And then their people, the Beitarim, stayed in the neighborhood and defended the neighborhood by shooting and such. He said, "You'll never hear the story from anyone else. It's not included in the official history books because it wasn't done by the Haganah." That was how he told me the story. And that goes on throughout. If you ask the Haganah historians today, or certainly 10 or 20, 30 years ago, who liberated Jaffa, they wouldn't have said it was the Irgun. This was, the Irgun and the Haganah, the Irgun and the Lehi didn't contribute anything. If we asked Ben Gurion officially 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, he was dead already, but 50, 60 years ago, why we have a Jewish state, the Irgun and Lehi played no part in it. It was the socialist movement that built the kibbutzim and brought us to the farms. That's what created the Jewish state, not the fighting Irgun and Lehi. But yet, it was the Irgun and Lehi that got the British out and allowed him to be the prime minister, as you have said in your very perceptive and detailed question or account that you just gave. So this is a matter of there being a group of people. I forget who wrote this in Eldad's journal in Sulam. There was a doctor who wrote this. I forget his name, but he had this view that there was a limited Zionism, a small or a minor Zionism, and a major or a larger Zionism. And the minor one wants to be small, wants to get by, wants the Nebuch will manage and keep what we can and always preserve what we have. And the larger one dreams of redemption and the complete land and in all these other things. We would with Stern and to some extent with the Irgun, and the first group we would associate with the establishment through the years. And according to him, it's the people who believe in major Zionism who move us forward and accomplish all these things, and whose views are eventually adopted by the minors. So then I have to ask, who is running the show? Is it the major ones who, even though they're never in power, they never do what they want as they want to, always in the end get what they want done? Or is it the minor people who are opposed, certainly in word and maybe in thought, to this major view of Zionism, who always stay in power, no matter what's being done? So who's running the show and who's getting what they want? Is it these small people or the big people? And I'm not sure you can answer that question. You take the best view of all of this. I thought you were going to say this too, because you gave such great details and such great examples. But the clearest view is Jabotinsky, who's promoting creating a Jewish army when the others are saying no and is calling for a Jewish state. When the Zionist organization, when Ben Gurion and the Statut and the Zionist organization don't want a Jewish state. And Jabotinsky says, we're at a Zionist Congress. If you won't say that our goal is a Zionist state, a Jewish state, what are we doing? What are you talking about? And they say, we won't vote for that. No Jewish state. We want a Jewish home. We want a Jewish state, the other national, who knows what, but not a state. And then we need an army. In the 30s, he talks about an army, and they don't want to talk. They call him a fascist because he wants an army. And in the end, of course, it's the other side. It's not Jabotinsky who brings the state and creates the army. So who did it? Was it Jabotinsky or was it the other side?
You have a new book out, which is the poems of Avram Stern, right? Maybe you could show it to the audience.
A Soldier and a Poet, the collected poems of Avraham Yair Stern. I translated them. These are his entire poetic oeuvre, all of his poems. None of the other writings that he did there are not poems, his poetry is steeped as he was himself in the Bible and Jewish history, and the Hebrew poetry that he wrote has words in it that, unless you're familiar with the Bible, you cannot have a possible idea of what he means. And even if you are familiar with the Bible, sometimes I had to compare the commentaries of Rashi and Ibn Ezra and other people just to try to figure out what a word meant even in the Bible, because there's no agreement among the Jewish commentators about what the word meant. And in order to translate his poems, I went through about 1,000 pages of manuscripts, reading all of the different versions that he put together for each poem. And that way I was able to make sure that I did not mistranslate what I hope, make sure that I didn't translate a single word. So for the first time ever, an English language audience can read not one or two poems of Stern's that have been translated here or there, maybe especially in the 40s, but read all of his work in an accurate translation. It was published by the Lehi Heritage Foundation in Tel Aviv as the official translation of his poems, and approved by his son.
So this kind of brings me to my final question. It's a little bit difficult to find your books. Amazon only has Stern, The Man and His Gang. If you could send me some links where the audience could buy your books, I would be happy to put them in the description of this podcast.
I'll try. I'm not up to date on what's available where. I know A Soldier and a Poet is available on Amazon. It hasn't officially been released, but it is being sold on Amazon. I bought a copy a few weeks ago. But the official release date, I think, is this week or next week or something like that. I don't know. But I will look around and see what else is available where. I know that the Pomerantz bookstore in Jerusalem sells several of the books that I've done in Hebrew and in English. And the Lehi Heritage Foundation in Tel Aviv sells also about 5 or 6 books that I've done. Beit Jabotinsky, the Jabotinsky Institute sells 1 or 2.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll put links to all of that in the description. Zev, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a pleasure, and I hope we can do it again in the future.
Thank you so much for your time and for asking such good questions and giving such interesting commentary.